They thought they had all the power. The HOA, fueled by pettiness and control, crossed a line they could never step back from. It started with a simple rule, a demand no reasonable person would take seriously. But when one family pushed back, the neighborhood turned into a battlefield of fines, threats, and intimidation. What the HOA didn't realize was that their target wasn't just any homeowner, and the fallout would shake the entire community. So, how far can power-hungry neighbors really go before it all comes crashing down? The family had moved into the neighborhood with high hopes. The quiet streets, well-kept lawns, and promise of a safe community seemed like everything they had been looking for. Their days were filled with the kind of simple routines that made life feel stable: kids riding bikes on the sidewalks, weekend barbecues, and neighbors exchanging polite waves across trimmed hedges. On the surface, it looked like the perfect suburban dream. But behind the manicured lawns and neatly painted fences, there was an invisible tension: rules that governed everything from the shade of your shutters to the height of your grass. For most people, it was easy enough to follow along. But for this family, the rules were about to take a dark, personal turn. The homeowner, proud yet easygoing, never imagined he'd find himself on the wrong side of the HOA. He worked long hours to provide for his family, hoping that the neighborhood would offer the peace of mind he had worked so hard to achieve. His teenage son, full of energy and independence, became the center of his world. Every evening, the sound of laughter from their backyard felt like proof that they had chosen the right place to call home. Neighbors saw them as friendly, approachable, and respectful. But in communities like these, appearances can change overnight. A single misunderstanding, a complaint whispered in the wrong ear, or even something as small as "who parked in the wrong spot" could shift perceptions instantly. And that shift was about to happen. The HOA, known for its iron grip on the community, had been watching closely. Their rules weren't just guidelines, they were weapons, ready to be used against anyone who didn't fall in line. And soon, one small, seemingly harmless event involving the family's teenage son would ignite a storm that exposed just how fragile peaceful living in a homeowners association could be. At first, the tension showed up in small, almost forgettable ways. A letter slipped under the door about noise concerns, a notice taped to the mailbox about parking violations, the kind of things most people would brush off, chalking it up to overzealous neighbors. But these weren't accidents, they were warning signals that the HOA had chosen its target. The homeowner, already juggling work and family responsibilities, found himself buried under an endless stream of complaints. The grass was an inch too tall. The garbage cans weren't pulled back quickly enough. His son's friends, just teenagers hanging out after school, were suddenly labeled a nuisance. Each letter came with a thinly veiled threat: fix it or pay the fine, and the fines weren't small. They stacked quickly, turning everyday life into a constant battle to stay compliant. Every attempt to reason with the HOA seemed to backfire. Meetings that were supposed to be discussions turned into public shamings, with board members lecturing him about rules as though he were a delinquent child. The homeowner kept his composure, but the humiliation stung. He began to realize this wasn't about rules at all, it was about control. And once the HOA sensed defiance, they tightened their grip. Things escalated when his teenage son became the center of their complaints. The board accused him of loitering, of bringing the wrong kind of visitors into the community. They even claimed his presence was disturbing the peace. For the father, it was a breaking point. His son wasn't some troublemaker, he was a kid, enjoying his youth, spending time with friends, sometimes even welcoming military visitors who had every right to be there. But the HOA twisted the truth, painting innocent moments as dangerous violations. Late-night knocks on the door became routine. Anonymous notes appeared in the mailbox, demanding the family get in line. Security patrols began driving past their house more frequently, slowing down just enough to make their presence known. What was once a safe haven had turned into a surveillance zone, with every move watched, every action judged. The father tried to rally support from neighbors, but fear kept most people silent. No one wanted to be the next target. Some whispered their sympathy behind closed doors, but when it came to standing up to the board, they disappeared. The family was on their own. Then came the breaking point. The HOA issued a formal warning that if the disturbances didn't stop, law enforcement would be called. It sounded absurd, laughable even, but deep down the father knew they were serious. And soon, the flashing lights of police cruisers appeared outside his home not because of a crime, but because the HOA had weaponized authority to enforce their petty vendettas. For the father, it was a mix of rage and disbelief. How could something as ridiculous as a teenager having friends over spiral into police intervention, but the HOA wasn't finished? The visit from law enforcement wasn't just about intimidation, it was about making a statement to the entire neighborhood. If you defy the board, you will be punished. And yet, what the HOA didn't know was that their actions were about to backfire in a way no one could have predicted. Because among the people visiting his son that week were individuals they never should have crossed. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in chaos. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering among themselves as uniformed officers stepped onto the lawn. For the father, it felt surreal. His teenage son wasn't in trouble, he had done nothing more than host a few friends, but here were police, summoned not by crime, but by an HOA desperate to prove its power. The board members stood at the edge of the street, arms crossed, their smug expressions lit by the glow of the patrol cars. The homeowner's pulse thundered in his ears. He had endured months of harassment, fines, and humiliation, but this moment the sight of officers at his door, because of his son, was unbearable. He braced himself for the confrontation, prepared to defend his family yet again. But then something happened the HOA never could have predicted. From the backyard, figures emerged, his son's visitors. They weren't rowdy teenagers, they weren't criminals. They were men and women in military uniforms, decorated Navy SEALs who had quietly dropped by to see the boy they'd mentored. They stepped forward calmly, their presence commanding silence, their demeanor making it instantly clear that this was no ordinary group of guests. The officers, once stern, immediately shifted their tone. Respect replaced suspicion. The HOA members, who had been gloating moments earlier, faltered, their arrogance melting into unease. The father didn't need to say a word, the sight spoke louder than anything. The board had tried to weaponize the law to embarrass him, but instead, they had humiliated themselves in front of the entire community. The SEALs explained the situation with quiet authority, making it clear there was no wrongdoing, no disturbance, nothing warranting police involvement. And as the officers nodded in agreement, the tension broke. The crowd of watching neighbors now saw the truth. The HOA's obsession wasn't about rules or order, it was about control, about punishing one family for daring to resist. One board member tried to argue, sputtering about proper procedure and community standards, but the words fell flat. The officers, visibly unimpressed, reminded the HOA that calling the police over petty complaints was not only inappropriate, it was an abuse of public resources. The shame was unmistakable. The very authority the board had weaponized had turned against them. For the father, it was more than vindication, it was liberation. Months of fear and humiliation washed away in a single moment of undeniable truth. The HOA had exposed itself as petty and powerless, and the whole neighborhood had seen it. But as satisfying as the humiliation was, one thought lingered in his mind. What happens next? Would the board back down, or would they double down on their campaign of control? One thing was certain, the balance of power in the community had shifted forever. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different. Word of what happened spread quickly. Neighbors, who had once whispered behind curtains, now spoke openly about what they'd seen. The HOA's attempt to weaponize the police had backfired spectacularly, leaving board members red-faced and scrambling to justify their actions. Their carefully crafted image of protectors of community order had been shattered in front of the very people they claimed to represent. The homeowner's family, once isolated and fearful, suddenly found support pouring in. Quiet neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up finally shared their own stories, fines for flower beds that were too colorful, warnings about holiday decorations that weren't community approved, even threats for leaving bicycles in driveways. The HOA's authority had thrived on silence, but now, silence was broken. And with that, the board's power began to crack. The police report of the incident became another nail in the coffin. Officers had documented the frivolous nature of the call, and the mention of Navy SEALs as witnesses gave the story weight no one could dismiss. Rumors swirled about legal repercussions, and though the family chose not to drag it further, the threat of accountability loomed heavy over the HOA. Board meetings, once a place for arrogance and intimidation, turned into tense gatherings filled with pointed questions and sharp criticism from residents who had finally had enough. For the father, the change was personal as well as public. His son, who had been unfairly painted as a problem, was now seen in a new light, a young man with connections, respect, and integrity that far outshone the pettiness of the board. The humiliation the family had endured was replaced by something stronger: vindication. But the real impact went beyond one family's victory. The incident served as a reminder that unchecked power, even in something as small as a neighborhood HOA, can corrode the very community it claims to protect. People realized that rules meant to preserve order could just as easily be twisted into weapons of control. And once the truth was exposed, there was no going back. The father often looked out at his street with a new perspective. The manicured lawns and quiet evenings were still there, but now they carried a lesson. Peace doesn't come from blind obedience to those in charge, it comes from standing firm when that power is abused. And so, the question lingers for anyone living under the thumb of a petty HOA. What would you do if the rules meant to protect your home became the very thing threatening it?